Edward was thrown out of Christmas like an unwanted guest in the very house he built, told by his own son Matthew that there was no place for him because Clara's family didn't want him around. The words cut sharper than any blade erasing decades of sacrifice. Every lone and sleepless night poured into their comfort. He sat in silence, humiliated, heart-pounding, staring at the luxury decorations he had paid for, yet was forbidden to enjoy. The betrayal was merciless, a wound deeper than death itself. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. What Edward does next will shock everyone. Edward stood in the silence of that living room, his eyes cutting across every detail with a sharpened edge of fury. The silk curtains swayed slightly from the heat vents, a whisper of air that reminded him of the second mortgage he had taken out to cover them. Each hardwood plank beneath his shoes had cost him nights of broken sleep, overtime shifts, and checks signed with hands trembling from exhaustion. The chandelier above the dining table flickered in the glow of 1,000 Christmas lights, its glass prisms casting fractured colors against the walls. He remembered the day Claire insisted it was essential for hosting her dinner parties. Essential. The word echoed like a sneer. He had drained a credit card to make that moment happen, telling himself it was an investment in his son's future. What he had really bought was his own humiliation. His gaze shifted to the gleaming appliances in the kitchen beyond the archway. A $2,000 mixer sat proudly on the counter, untouched since the day it arrived. Clara's so-called passion for baking had lasted less than a month. Now it was a symbol of his foolishness, a monument to how easily his kindness had been exploited. Edward's jaw tightened as the memory surfaced of signing yet another check. The polite lies Clara told about how much it would mean to her, how Matthew had stood behind her, nodding like a loyal soldier. Every item in this house had been extracted from him not with gratitude, but with entitlement. He remembered the down payment the day at the bank, when the loan officer warned him about the risks. Edward had laughed then, foolishly proud to play the role of the provider, confident that sacrifice for family could never turn sour. Now, standing in the hollow echo of his son's rejection, those signatures on loan papers felt like iron chains dragging him under. The numbers rattled in his mind like dice rolling across a casino table. $2,800 a month, $33,000 a year, $140,000 gone to keep Matthew's dream alive. His dream and Clara's kingdom built on the ruins of Edward's retirement. On the walls, framed photos tracked the slow erasure of his presence. In the earliest ones, he stood tall, his arm around Matthew at graduations and birthdays. But frame by frame, his image shrank, moved to the edges until finally he was absent altogether. It was as if the family he had created had carefully edited him out of their story. The truth hit him like a cold wind. He was not a father in this house. He was a wallet, a convenient ATM dressed in aging skin. Edward's chest tightened, not from weakness, but from a rising storm of clarity. Every curtain, every polished tile, every stitched sofa cushion carried his fingerprints, his blood, his labor. And yet he had been told to vanish, discarded, like a seasonal decoration no longer needed. The bitterness hardened inside him, sharp and unrelenting. He was finished pretending that love was enough to justify this betrayal. As the December night pressed against the windows, Edward felt a calmness settle over him. Not peace, but precision. The cold calculation of a man who finally saw the truth with brutal clarity. He walked slowly to the door, his eyes catching the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. It was not the image of a broken man. It was the face of someone who had been stripped bare and was ready to act. And deep in that silence, Edward knew the sacrifices he had made would no longer be buried. They would become weapons. What he chose to do next would shake the foundation of this house more than any storm. Matthew's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. He didn't even look his father in the eye when he said it, just shifted uncomfortably on the leather couch and muttered that maybe Edward could spend Christmas at Aunt Rose's, or perhaps they could meet up the weekend after. The weekend after. as if Christmas, a day Edward had poured his soul into for decades, was nothing more than a dentist appointment to be rescheduled for convenience. His son's voice carried no warmth, no trace of hesitation, just the cold, efficient tone of someone trying to clear a burden from his calendar. Edward's chest tightened as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He stood surrounded by decorations he had paid for, lights twinkling on the 12-foot tree that had taken him hours to help install, ornaments Clara had ordered online with his money, each one chosen not for sentiment, but for style. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla from overpriced candles she had scattered around, but none of it felt like home. Not anymore. The realization cut deeper than the words themselves. He was being dismissed not only from their holiday, but from their lives, carved out like a character in a play who no longer fit the script. The humiliation bled into every corner of his body. He remembered years past when Matthew was a boy who ran into his arms on Christmas morning, unwrapping toys bought with money Edward didn't have but found a way to earn. Those memories now felt like cruel illusions. The boy who once called him hero now looked at him with unease, almost embarrassment, as though Edward's presence threatened to spoil the perfect image Clara wanted to present to her family. He was no longer father, no longer anchor. He was an outsider whose absence was more convenient than his presence. The loneliness hit harder than the cold outside. He imagined himself at Aunt Rose's table, politely laughing through conversations that weren't his eating food, that wasn't prepared with him in mind, while his son toasted champagne in a house built from Edward's sacrifices. The thought made his stomach knot. The idea of spending Christmas alone, exiled from his own blood, clawed at him. He wasn't just being left out of a holiday. He was being erased from the story of his family like an old photograph shoved into a drawer. Edward steadied himself, his hand gripping the doorknob with a force that made his knuckles whiten. Behind him, laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen, where Clara hummed to herself, already rehearsing for her perfect holiday performance. Matthew's silence was heavier than any goodbye. Edward didn't wait for more excuses. He stepped into the freezing night, the glow of the house burning behind him, like a beacon he would never approach again. As the door closed, the truth became undeniable. He was no longer a father in this house. He was a ghost, dismissed and discarded, left to find scraps of belonging elsewhere. And yet beneath the crushing weight of despair, something sharper stirred, a blade glinting in the dark. He might be erased in their eyes, but he was far from finished. What he would choose to do next would turn their perfect world upside down. The December air struck Edward like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, yet it was cleaner than the suffocating silence he had left behind. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved down the walkway, each step heavy with memories that refused to die. The house behind him gleamed in the darkness, windows glowing with the warmth of a family gathering that excluded him, a stage he had built but was forbidden to enter. Twinkling lights wrapped around the roofline pulsed like mockery, their cheer taunting him with every flicker. He had strung lights like those, once climbing ladders in the bitter cold to bring joy to his son. Now those same lights illuminated his exile. He paused at the edge of the driveway, staring at the massive wreath Clara had insisted on, a $1,000 circle of imported greenery and ornaments. He remembered her smug smile when it arrived, her casual mention that it would elevate the curb appeal. He had signed the check, telling himself it was worth it to keep the peace. Standing there now, watching the wreath glow under the porch light, Edward realized he had been buying his own invisibility, one extravagant purchase at a time. The cold wind pushed against his face, but he didn't bow to it. His back remained straight, his chin held firm. He would not give Clara or Matthew the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Pride was all he had left, and he clung to it like armor. Inside the house, faint echoes of music and laughter drifted through the walls, the sounds of celebration he had been denied. His chest tightened, but his expression stayed carved from stone. He would not let them see the man they thought they had defeated. As he reached his truck, Edward rested his hand on the cold metal, letting the chill bite into his skin. He looked once more at the house, not with longing, but with a searing clarity. Every corner, Every shining surface inside belonged to him, yet he was treated as though he had no claim. The truth stabbed deeper than the frost. He had built an empire for others and been cast out from his own kingdom. He climbed into the driver's seat, silence filling the cab like a sanctuary. For a moment he simply sat there, watching the house fade in the rear-view mirror as he turned the key. The engine growled to life, a sound of defiance against the winter night. His breath fogged the windshield, and in that haze he saw the ghost of Maria's smile, the memory of Christmases when family meant more than appearances. He gripped the wheel tighter, forcing back the grief. Dignity demanded control, and control meant moving forward. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, while behind him the house glittered with false warmth. Edward drove away slowly each mile, putting distance between him and the betrayal. Yet as the lights of the neighborhood disappeared in the rear view, something colder than the air settled in his chest. Pride had carried him out with his head high, but pride alone would not be enough. There was a storm gathering in him, and it demanded release. What he would unleash next would not be forgotten. Edward steered the truck through the winding streets of the neighborhood, headlights slicing through the December dark, and with every turn the past rose up to meet him. These were the same streets he had driven for years back when the world still felt whole. He saw ghosts in every corner. The corner store where he used to stop for hot chocolate mix on snowy nights when Matthew would beg for extra marshmallows. The park where they once dragged a sled up the hill, laughing until their lungs burned, both of them collapsing in the snow, faces red, eyes bright. Those nights had been loud with joy. Now the silence in the cab was louder still. He turned onto Cedar Lane, and the glow of holiday lights from other homes stabbed at him like a cruel reminder. Families gathered around tables inside, their laughter spilling into the cold air. Edward could almost hear the echoes of his own house years ago, Maria pulling a turkey from the oven, the scent of sage and butter filling every room. Matthew, still small then, would dart around with uncontainable excitement, tugging at Edward's sleeve, begging to open just one present before dinner. Edward always gave in. His son's wide-eyed wonder had been worth every concession. Now those same memories pressed against his chest like weights, choking him with the knowledge that the boy who once lit up Christmas had grown into a man who cast his father out of it. He slowed as he passed the old church at the corner, the bell tower glowing faintly under the street lamps. They had sat there every Christmas Eve for years. Maria's hand in his, Matthew fidgeting impatiently through the hymns, his voice rising just enough to be off-key but earnest. Edward could still hear that boyish singing in his mind, so sharp and innocent. It was unbearable now, like hearing a song he loved played off-key by strangers. The truck rolled past the high school football field where Matthew once played under the Friday night lights. Edward had sat on those bleachers in the freezing cold, his thermos of coffee steaming in the air, cheering until his voice went hoarse. He had shouted Matthew's name into the night, proud enough to make his chest ache. But tonight, driving past the same chain-link fences, that pride had soured into something bitter. He wondered if Matthew remembered those nights at all, or if Clara had erased them too, replacing memories with obligations and appearances. The ache of loss swelled as Edward turned toward the outskirts of town. He had given everything, his money, his strength, his devotion, because he believed family was forever. Now those same streets that once carried him home carried only the proof of what he had lost. The past clung to him like smoke, beautiful and suffocating all at once. He tightened his grip on the wheel, forcing his eyes forward. The memories tore at him, but they also sharpened him. If the past had been joy, the present was betrayal, and betrayal demanded an answer. Ahead, the darkness of the highway opened wide, and Edward knew the next mile would not be driven by grief alone. Something colder was guiding him now, something that would soon surface with a vengeance. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt glowing faintly beneath the dim streetlights, and Edward's mind began to tally the cost of his devotion with brutal precision. $2,800 a month. He could see the checks in his memory, neat blue ink signing away his future, month after month, year after year, until the total had swollen into a figure that made his gut tighten: over $140,000. He had gutted his own retirement, stripped his savings bare, and told himself it was love. He had called it sacrifice, a father's duty. But now he saw it for what it truly was. A noose he had tied around his own neck, handed willingly to his son and daughter-in-law. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as he recalled the excuses Matthew had whispered over the years. Just until I get back on my feet. Just until work stabilizes. Just until Clara's new business takes off. Each promise dangled like bait, and Edward had bitten down every time. He remembered Clara's smile as she accepted his checks, her manicured fingers brushing his hand like a thank you that cost her nothing. Behind her eyes there had never been gratitude, only calculation. He could see it now with blistering clarity, the way her gaze would drift past him as though already spending the money before it left his account. The numbers haunted him. $140,000 could have been a cushion for his twilight years, a safety net for hospital bills, or a trip Maria had always dreamed of taking to the Grand Canyon. Instead, it had bought silk curtains, imported rugs, a mixer that sat unused, and a mortgage on a house where he was now unwelcome. Edward pressed the accelerator harder, the growl of the engine matching the storm building inside him. He had given his son the gift of security and received nothing but erasure in return. He thought of Maria, her voice soft yet steady on the nights when he confessed he was worried about money. She had always told him to be careful, to remember they were not made of endless resources. But Edward had looked at his son and seen possibility, the future he wanted to protect at any cost. He had believed that love was measured in sacrifice, that giving more meant loving deeper. Tonight, that belief felt like the cruelest lie of all. The realization burned through him sharp and merciless. He was not a provider anymore. He was prey. And the people he had trusted most had fed on him until nothing was left but regret. Edward's eyes narrowed against the blur of headlights rushing past. The ledger of his life had been written in sacrifice, but it was time to balance the account. And when he did, Matthew and Clara would learn the true cost of what they had taken. The road unfurled before him in long, silent miles, but Edward's mind was anything but quiet. Images came back sharp as shards of glass, each one slicing deeper than the last. Clara's voice sweetened with false charm, asking for just one more thing. A purse that cost nearly a month of his pension, justified with a laugh about quality lasting forever. A vacation upgrade pitched as an opportunity to bond as a family when all it had done was drain him further. That gleaming mixer, sitting smug and unused on the counter, had been the final insult. $2,000 for a hobby that lasted less than 3 weeks. He saw it now for what it truly was, bait dangled by a woman who knew how to twist kindness into a leash. Every scene replayed with new clarity, and the bitterness inside him grew jagged and unrelenting. He recalled the way Clara had stood behind Matthew during their pleas, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, as if she were the loyal partner supporting her husband. But Edward knew better now. She had been the director all along, pulling the strings while his son danced to her tune, and he had paid for every performance. Each dollar he handed over hadn't been a gift, it had been another brick in the palace she was building for herself. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the erosion of respect. Edward could see it in Clara's eyes whenever she looked at him. To her, he wasn't a father-in-law. He wasn't even a man. He was a means to an end, a wallet disguised as family. That realization tightened his chest with rage so pure it felt cold. He had excused her manipulations for years, convincing himself she was young, ambitious, maybe even insecure. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. She had seen his generosity as weakness and devoured it without hesitation. He thought of the moments she had thanked him with exaggerated smiles, words dripping with practiced sincerity. He had wanted so desperately to believe those thanks were real, that his sacrifices were seen. Now he knew they were rehearsed lines delivered to keep him compliant. The bitterness hardened into something sharper. Clara had mistaken his patience for blindness. She had mistaken his silence for consent. That mistake would cost her more than she could ever imagine. Edward gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes narrowing as he pushed the truck deeper into the night. The past no longer blinded him. It fueled him. He wasn't the doting father anymore, bending under the weight of endless demands. He was a man stripped bare of illusions, and in that bareness he found clarity. They had written him out of their story, but the story wasn't finished. Far from it. Something darker, steadier was beginning to take form inside him, and when it surfaced, Clara would learn that every manipulation carried a price, and Edward was ready to collect. The phone rang in the hollow silence of Edward's house, its shrill cry cutting through the stillness like a blade. He let it ring 3 times before picking up each chime, stoking the fire already burning in his chest. On the 4th, he pressed the receiver to his ear and heard her voice, Clara. Sweet as honey, smooth as silk, dripping with the kind of practiced charm that once might have fooled him. Edward, she cooed, stretching his name as though it were a caress. I just wanted to check on you, see how you're doing tonight. The words curled into his ear like smoke, but all he smelled was poison. For years he had mistaken that tone for kindness. He had let her syrupy politeness soften his resolve, had believed her when she said she valued his support, when she called him generous, when she spoke of family as though she actually meant it. Now, stripped of illusions, he heard what had always been beneath the surface: manipulation disguised as sweetness, greed camouflaged as care. Her voice no longer soothed it, grated each syllable a reminder of the lies he had swallowed whole. He said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch. He could almost hear her unease on the other end, a faint hitch in her breath, as though she wondered if he was about to hang up. Instead, he let her fill the void with more sugar-coated words, thanking him again for the curtains, for the new flooring, for all the little things he had provided to make their home perfect. Each phrase was a knife twisted deeper, but now he felt no wound, only clarity. When he finally spoke, his tone was even almost flat. Is that why you called, Clara, to list my contributions like a receipt? He heard the sharp inhale, the pause, before she recovered her laugh, light and hollow. Oh, Edward, don't be silly. We're family. I just wanted to make sure you're not feeling left out. You know how my parents are with traditions. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. The phrase dripped into him like acid. She had used it before, when she dismissed his sacrifices as obligations, when she excused her extravagance as normal. Tonight it rang like the cold truth of a woman who never saw him as anything more than a resource. Edward leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him, his eyes locked on the cracked ceiling above. He let her finish her performance, every laugh, every softened word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He listened, not to her lies, but to the clarity they revealed. The mask was off, at least for him. Clara hadn't called to check on him. She had called to test his weakness, to see if the old fool would still bend, still provide, still play his role in her carefully crafted play. When the call ended, Edward lowered the phone slowly, his face carved in stone. The bitterness had burned away, leaving only resolve. Her performance had confirmed what he already knew: the game was rigged, and he had been the mark for far too long. But she had miscalculated. The man she thought she could play with honeyed words no longer existed, and soon she would discover what it meant when silence turned into strategy. Edward sat in the dim light of his study long after Clara's voice faded from the line, the receiver resting heavy in his hand. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, like the pause before a blade falls. He placed the phone back in its cradle with a calm so precise it bordered on unnatural. The man who once reacted with guilt, who scrambled to appease every demand, was gone. In his place stood someone sharper, colder, honed by betrayal into something far more dangerous. He did not rage. He did not shout at the walls or curse Clara's name into the night. Instead, he let stillness become his ally. His breath evened out. His heartbeat slowed, and in that measured rhythm came clarity. He replayed every word she had spoken, every laugh, every insincere reassurance. Each phrase slid into place like pieces of a puzzle, and when the picture formed, it revealed the truth he had ignored for too long. They believed he was powerless. They believed his silence was weakness. Edward leaned forward, elbows pressing into the worn surface of the desk. The wood bore scratches from years of bills paid and letters written, a battlefield of ink and sacrifice. Tonight it became something else. A command center. He reached for a notepad, the same one he once used to track Matthew's baseball schedules and grocery lists Maria handed him. The paper now carried sharper weight. He drew a line straight across the top and wrote a single word, justice. Beneath it, he began to outline what had to be done. It wasn't rage that guided his pen, but calculation. He considered the mortgage payment's first 40 checks written, cashed, and consumed. He noted the accounts, the timelines, the leverage. He thought about Clara's indulgences, her taste for things she could never afford without his name on the line. He thought about Matthew, his son, blinded by her charm but complicit in his silence. Their greed had created a pattern, and patterns could be unraveled. Edward's eyes flicked toward the framed photograph of Maria on the bookshelf. Her smile, caught forever in summer light, steadied his resolve. She had always warned him not to give so much that he disappeared in the process. He hadn't listened then, but he heard her now. Every betrayal had brought him to this point. Every quiet humiliation carved away the man he used to be, leaving only the steel beneath. He closed the notepad, set the pen carefully on top, and leaned back. The house around him hummed in the winter quiet, but Edward no longer felt the weight of exile. For the first time in years, he felt control settling into his hands, heavy and certain. His silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. And when the time came to break it, Matthew and Clara would hear not the voice of a broken father, but the strike of judgment they never saw coming. Edward rose from his chair with a steadiness that belied the storm brewing inside him. The decision had crystallized hard and sharp in the silence after Clara's call. He would not give them another cent, not a dollar more of his sweat, his labor, his future. The house they flaunted, the life they built on his back, it would all unravel the moment he cut the cord. They had mistaken his silence for surrender, his patience for blindness. But now every check they had cashed had become a weapon in his hand, and he would wield it without mercy. He walked into the kitchen, flicked on the harsh overhead light, and pulled open the drawer where years of receipts and bank statements lay tucked in careful stacks. Paper whispered against paper as he sorted through them, a ledger of betrayal dressed as generosity. Each line item was a scar: mortgage installments, luxury purchases, emergency transfers. He had been their safety net, their benefactor, their fool. No longer. He placed the latest mortgage coupon on the counter and pressed his palm flat against it. His hand didn't shake. In that single motion, he severed the leash they had fastened around his throat. The thought of Clara's face when the next payment failed made his lips tighten into something almost like a smile. Not amusement, satisfaction. He pictured her perfect composure cracking, the panic seeping in when she realized the lifeline was gone. He pictured Matthew scrambling, making excuses, finally tasting the weight of responsibility he had so carelessly dumped onto his father's shoulders. They had wanted Edward erased, irrelevant, powerless. Instead, they were about to learn he had been the foundation beneath them all along, and foundations know how to crumble a house when they choose. He moved through the rooms of his modest home with renewed purpose. The air felt different, sharper, as if even the walls understood what was about to unfold. He thought of Maria again, her quiet warnings, her steady wisdom. She would not have wanted him to suffer in silence. She would have wanted him to stand tall to protect the dignity he had nearly traded away for empty gratitude. And tonight he was finally listening. Edward poured himself a glass of water, the ordinary act transformed into ritual. He raised it slightly toward the photograph of Maria on the mantel, a silent toast. Then he drank the cool liquid, steadying him, grounding him for what was to come. He was not rushing into fury. He was stepping into control. When he set the glass down, his eyes burned with resolve. Canceling the mortgage was only the beginning. Clara and Matthew believed they had won, but they hadn't seen the depth of his resolve, the steel of a man who had built everything with his own hands and could just as easily take it away. The first strike had been chosen, but the war was only beginning, and Edward was ready to fight it on his terms. Edward's story is more than family drama. It's a reminder of how love, when taken for granted, can become a weapon against us. Many parents sacrifice everything believing unconditional giving will always be honored. Yet true love must walk hand in hand with respect, and respect is lost when boundaries are ignored. Edward's decision to stop funding his son's life wasn't born of spite. It was an act of reclaiming dignity, proving that self-worth should never be sold for the illusion of harmony. For older generations, the lesson is clear. Protecting your future is not selfish, it is necessary. Setting limits doesn't mean loving less. It means preserving enough of yourself to be seen, heard, and valued. No parent should become invisible in the home they helped build. Sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching others that gratitude must be matched with responsibility. If this story resonates with you, don't just watch, reflect. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that respect cannot be bought and dignity must never be surrendered. And if you believe in stories that bring both truth and justice to life, subscribe now and join us for the next chapter.